The incense was still burning on the altar when the young king fell to his knees and wept, not from joy, but from terror. He was about to inherit the throne of the greatest kingdom on earth, and he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Picture it, 20 years old, maybe younger, the weight of a nation resting on shoulders that had never carried anything heavier than a harp or a scroll. His father was gone. The empire his father had bled for was now his to lose. He had the crown, he had the palace, he had armies waiting for his command. And in the silence of that night, alone before God, he had nothing else. No experience, no answers, no confidence that he would not be the king who destroyed everything his father had built. Because before he was the wisest man who ever lived, he was the most unprepared man who ever lived. Think about who he could have been. The son of the great warrior king, the heir of promises spoken over his family generations before his birth. The boy who grew up walking through palace halls, still echoing with the songs his father wrote, the battles his father won, the sins his father never quite escaped. He had every reason to believe he was destined for greatness, and every reason to be crushed under the fear that he would never measure up to it. And then, everything turned. In one night, in one dream, in one quiet and terrifying moment before the Lord, this frightened young man was asked a question that would define not just his reign, but the way we understand wisdom itself 3,000 years later. What would you ask for if God appeared to you tonight and said, "Ask, and I will give it"? This is the story of King Solomon. It is a story about the difference between being given everything and knowing what to do with it. It is a story of a man who reached a height of glory almost no human being has ever touched, and who, in the end, discovered that glory alone could not save him.
Stay with me, because before this story ends, a kingdom will split in two, a temple will rise in gold, and a man who once had all the wisdom in the world will look back at his own life and ask if any of it mattered at all. Jerusalem, nearly 3,000 years ago, was not yet the city of legend. It was a city still finding its feet, still smelling of fresh mortar and unfinished ambition. The air was thick with dust from the hills, sharp with the tang of cedar being hauled down from Lebanon, and heavy, always heavy, with the scent of incense drifting up from the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant still rested under a tent of curtains, waiting for a permanent home. This was a kingdom stitched together by war. Solomon's father had spent his life uniting tribes that had spent generations fighting each other, defeating enemies that had terrorized this land since before memory, and turning a scattering of hill towns into the beginning of an empire. It was glorious. It was also fragile. One wrong move, one weak decision, one moment of poor judgment from an untested new king, and it could all come apart at the seams. Solomon knew this. Everyone around him knew this. There were brothers who believed the throne should have been theirs. There were generals who had shed blood for this kingdom and were not certain a young man who had never led an army deserved to command it. There were foreign nations circling, watching, waiting to see if Israel's strength would crumble now that its old lion was dead. The stakes were not abstract. They were flesh and blood. If Solomon failed, people he loved would die. A dream, generations in the making, would collapse. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He went to Gibeon, to the high place where sacrifices were still made, and he offered up everything he had, 1,000 burnt offerings, an overwhelming, almost desperate act of worship from a man who did not know what else to give.
And that night, in his sleep, God came to him. "Ask what I shall give thee." Imagine that moment, not as a Sunday school image, but as it actually would have felt. The God of the universe standing before a frightened young man, offering him anything. Not some things, anything. Wealth beyond counting. Armies that could never be defeated. The lives of his enemies laid at his feet. A blank check written by the hand that made the stars. And Solomon did not ask for any of it. He said, "I am but a child. I know not how to go out or come in. Give thy servant an understanding heart, that I may discern between good and evil." He was dying, not physically, but somewhere deeper. Dying under the crushing knowledge that he could ruin everything his father had built with one bad decision, one act of favoritism, one moment of cowardice in front of the wrong enemy at the wrong time.
And so, offered the entire world, he asked instead for the one thing that terrified him most to be without: the ability to tell right from wrong, wisdom from foolishness, truth from flattering lies, when the fate of real people hung on his answer. And God was moved. "Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, nor riches, nor the life of thine enemies, behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart." And as if wisdom alone were not gift enough, God added what Solomon never asked for: riches, honor, a reign so glorious that no king before or after would rival it, so long as he walked in obedience. The crisis was over, but the story was only beginning. It didn't take long for the kingdom to test what this gift actually meant. 2 women came before the king, each holding a claim no court could easily untangle. They had lived together, given birth days apart, and now one child was dead and one was living. And both women, standing before the throne with raw grief and raw desperation in their eyes, claimed the living child as her own. There were no witnesses. There was no evidence. There was only 2 mothers screaming the same truth in opposite directions, and a king who had asked for wisdom, now facing the kind of impossible human tangle where wisdom is the only thing that can save a life. Solomon listened, and then, in front of the entire court, he said the words that would make grown men and women hold their breath. "Bring me a sword. Divide the living child in 2 and give half to the one and half to the other." For one horrifying second, it must have sounded like madness. A king ordering the death of an innocent child to settle a property dispute. But watch what happens next. One woman stays silent.
The other cries out, her voice breaking apart in front of everyone. "Oh, my Lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it." In that single cry, the truth revealed itself. Only a real mother would rather lose her child to another woman's arms than watch it die in her own. Solomon had never needed the sword at all. He had needed to see which woman loved the child more than she loved winning. And in that moment, all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him. This is where his legend was born. Word of this judgment spread past the borders of Israel, into kingdoms that had never cared what happened in this small nation in the hills. Word spread that here was a king who did not merely rule with power, but ruled with insight so sharp it seemed almost otherworldly. And with that reputation came something Solomon had never asked for and could not have imagined. An age of glory unlike anything the ancient world had seen. He built. Oh, how he built. For 7 years, an army of laborers, craftsmen, and stonecutters worked without pause to raise a temple to the God of Israel. A house not of mud, brick, and rough timber like the buildings around it, but of cut stone, so precisely fitted that not a single hammer blow was heard on the Temple Mount during its construction. Cedar from Lebanon lined its walls. Gold, not painted, not plated as an afterthought, but sheets of pure gold, covered its inner sanctuary from floor to ceiling. Cherubim, carved from olive wood, overlaid in gold, spread their wings across the Holy of Holies, standing guard over the place where the Ark of the Covenant would finally, after generations of wandering, come to rest.
And when it was finished, when the priests brought the ark into that inner room and stepped back, something happened that no architect, no craftsman, no king could have engineered. The cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house. Heaven itself came down to confirm that this was no ordinary building. It was the place where God had chosen to dwell among his people. Solomon stood before that glory and did something remarkable for a king at the height of his power. He prayed. Not with pride, but with humility that seems almost impossible given everything he had achieved. Will God indeed dwell with men on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have built? He asked God to hear the prayers of his people, even the prayers of foreigners who might one day come seeking this God from distant lands. He asked for mercy on a nation he knew even then would someday sin and stumble and need forgiveness. It is easy to imagine that Solomon, at this moment, believed the hardest chapter of his life was behind him. The frightened boy who once knelt weeping before an impossible throne was now a king whose name was spoken with awe across the ancient world. But watch closely, because open loops like this one rarely stay closed for long. The very gifts that made Solomon glorious were about to become the doorway through which his greatest failure would walk in. His wealth became almost unimaginable. Ships sailed for him to distant lands and returned laden with gold, with ivory, with apes and peacocks, with treasures no one in Israel had ever seen before. His wisdom became a spectacle that drew royalty from across the known world, kings and queens who had heard the stories and refused to believe them until they saw it with their own eyes. One of them was the Queen of Sheba. She came, the record tells us, to test him with hard questions, riddles, puzzles, the kind of impossible trick questions designed to expose a fraud. And Solomon told her all her questions. There was nothing hid from the king which he told her not. When she saw the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built and the wealth spread before her like something from a dream, the queen, a ruler herself, not easily impressed, had no breath left in her. It was, she said, even greater than the reports she had heard.
Behold, the half was not told me. This was the summit. This was as high as a human being could climb in that world. Wealth, wisdom, glory, and the respect of nations. And this is exactly where the story begins its slow, quiet descent into tragedy. Because Solomon, the man given an understanding heart to discern good from evil, began, piece by piece, marriage by marriage, to stop discerning at all.
He married far beyond what was wise. Hundreds of wives and hundreds more secondary wives. Many of them foreign princesses brought in through political alliances that seemed clever at the time. Each marriage sealed a treaty. Each treaty strengthened his borders. It must have felt, in the moment, like strategy, like wisdom, but it was, quietly, catastrophically, the opposite. Because these women came from nations that worshipped other gods, and Solomon, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of the same diplomatic instinct that had built his empire, perhaps simply out of the slow erosion that happens to any heart when it stops guarding itself, allowed altars to be built to those gods. In the city of the temple, in the shadow of the house where the glory of the Lord had once filled the room so thick that priests could not stand. For his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father.
Read that slowly, because it is one of the most sobering lines in the entire story. The wisest man who ever lived, the man who could resolve an impossible custody dispute with a single sentence, the man whose insight left queens speechless, could not, in the end, guard his own heart. Wisdom for other people's problems came easily to him. Wisdom for his own soul slipped through his fingers like sand. This is the tragedy underneath the glory. And it should terrify anyone watching who has ever believed that success, intelligence, or achievement is the same thing as faithfulness. It is not. You can build a temple with your hands and an altar to an idol in your heart on the very same afternoon. The consequence came, as it always does, not as a sudden lightning strike, but as a quiet, devastating verdict spoken into the silence of Solomon's own guilt. God told him plainly, "Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will surely rend the kingdom out of the hand of thy son."
The empire his father had bled to unite, the empire Solomon himself had spent decades expanding and adorning in gold, it would not survive his own choices. Not entirely. A remnant would remain, for the sake of a promise made to David long before, and for the sake of the city that bore God's name. But the unity, the glory, the golden age, that would end with him. Picture what those final years must have felt like. Not death by drama, but death by realization. The slow, grinding awareness that comes to a man late in life who understands, finally, what his choices actually cost. Because this is the same king who, in his later writings, would look back on everything: the wealth, the wives, the gardens, the music, the achievements no other man alive had matched, and write words that still stop readers cold thousands of years later. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit.
This was not the cry of a poor man who never had a chance. This was the cry of a man who had everything, absolutely everything a human life could contain, and discovered that none of it, on its own, could fill the hollow place inside him. He had asked God for wisdom once as a terrified young man, and God had given it freely. But wisdom is not the same as obedience. Insight is not the same as faithfulness. You can know exactly what is right, Solomon certainly did, and still, slowly, choose what is comfortable instead. And yet, and this matters enormously, the story does not end in despair. Even in his weariness, even after everything, Solomon's final recorded words in that same book circle back, exhausted but not without hope, to the one conclusion that still stood after all his searching had failed. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. The wisest fool in history, at the very end of his search for meaning, pointed back to the exact place he should have never wandered from. Where Solomon failed, someone greater was still to come. Because centuries later, another king would be born in that same land, in a city not far from the one Solomon adorned in gold, and he too would be called wise, would be called a king, would draw crowds from distant lands seeking to see him with their own eyes. But where Solomon built a temple of stone and cedar for God to dwell in, Christ himself became the temple, God dwelling not behind a curtain in a golden room, but in human flesh, walking among the very people he came to save. Where Solomon's heart was turned away by love for many, Christ's heart never wavered, not once, even as he walked toward a cross built specifically to break lesser men.
And where Solomon, given everything the world could offer, found it all to be vanity, Christ, who owned nothing, no palace, no gold, not even a place to lay his head, offered the one thing Solomon's wealth never could: life that does not run out, peace that does not depend on circumstance, a love that does not turn away even when we do. He is greater than Solomon, and yet he stood in Solomon's own city and said so himself to a generation that refused to see it. A queen once traveled from the ends of the earth to hear Solomon's wisdom, and yet a wisdom greater than Solomon's was standing in front of them, and many did not stop to listen. So here is the question this story leaves for you, and it is not a comfortable one. What have you been given? What wisdom, what success, what blessing that you have quietly allowed to turn your heart away from the one who gave it to you? It rarely happens all at once.
It happened to Solomon, one marriage, one compromise, one small altar at a time.
No one wakes up one morning and decides to abandon what they know is right. They drift there, decision by decision, telling themselves each one is harmless. And if you recognize some of that drifting in your own life tonight, the compromises that felt small, the heart that has quietly cooled toward the God who once filled you like glory filled that temple, you are not beyond reach. Solomon's story does not end with a God who abandons the unfaithful. It ends with a God who kept his promise to David's line anyway, who preserved a remnant, who was already even then writing toward a redemption Solomon could never have imagined. One that would not depend on any king's wisdom or wealth or faithfulness, but on the perfect faithfulness of one who was still to come. God is still writing stories like that. Stories of people who had everything and felt empty.
Stories of hearts that drifted and were brought home again. If Solomon's story teaches anything, it is that the emptiness you might be feeling right now, even surrounded by blessing, is not a flaw to hide. It is an invitation to look toward the one thing that was never meant to be found in gold or wives or wisdom or achievement, but only in Him. By the way, if these stories move you, consider subscribing. They take a great deal of work to make, and your support means a lot. And before you go, sit with this question for a moment, and if you feel like it, leave your answer in the comments. What is the one blessing in your life that you have let quietly become more important to you than the one who gave it?